She stood humiliated under the crystal chandeliers, her fiancé's cruel laugh echoing as he chose another. The elite whispered about her full figure, deeming her hopelessly unworthy. She turned to flee until the heavy brass doors violently slammed shut. The Vampire King had arrived and nobody was leaving. Amelia Crestmont smoothed the heavy crimson silk of her custom gown, her hands trembling slightly, as the private elevator ascended to the legendary hidden ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria. Tonight was the once-in-a-decade Winter Solstice Gala, a secretive gathering where New York's highest society mingled with the city's ancient immortal elite. For humans, an invitation was the ultimate validation of wealth and status. For Amelia, it was supposed to be the night her boyfriend Theodore Ashford, heir to the Ashford banking fortune, formally proposed. Theodore had insisted on the dress, or rather Amelia had insisted on the silhouette, while Theodore had subtly tried to steer her towards something more forgiving. Amelia was a woman of undeniable lush curves. She had full hips, a generous bust, and a soft, rounded stomach that the bias-cut silk clung to unapologetically. She loved her body, but in the ruthless, razor-thin world of the Manhattan elite and the even more archaic, restrictive beauty standards of the vampire nobility, she knew she stood out. Vampires, the rumors said, preferred their human companions to look like fragile, delicate porcelain dolls. As the elevator doors parted, revealing a breathtaking expanse of gilded arches, towering floral arrangements of midnight blue roses, and a sea of perfectly tailored aristocrats, Amelia took a deep breath. She stepped into the cavernous room, searching the crowd for Theodore. She found him standing near a towering champagne fountain, surrounded by a group of ancient, pale-skinned aristocrats. But he was not alone. Clinging to his arm was Geneviève Dupont, a French heiress known for her sharp cheekbones, and a figure so famously waifish, she looked as though a strong breeze might break her. Geneviève wore a sheer silver slip dress that hung loosely on her narrow frame. Amelia approached, forcing a warm, confident smile, though a cold knot tightened in her stomach. "Theodore," she said softly, her voice carrying over the low hum of the string quartet. Theodore turned, his expression instantly dropping from a charismatic laugh to a look of sheer panic, followed quickly by a chilling wave of annoyance. He did not reach out to her. Instead, he subtly pulled Geneviève closer to his side. The surrounding immortals, creatures who had lived for centuries, turned their piercing, unnatural gazes upon Amelia, their eyes raking over her full figure with undisguised disdain. "Amelia," Theodore said, his tone clipped, devoid of the warmth he used when they were alone in his penthouse. "You're late." The seamstress had to make a final adjustment to the bodice. Amelia explained, her cheeks flushing as she noticed Genevieve's slow, predatory smirk. "But I'm here now." Geneviève let out a high, melodic laugh that sounded like shattering glass. "Oh, Theodore, darling," she purred, her French accent thick and dripping with condescension. "Is this the complication you mentioned? The one from the suburbs?" Amelia froze. "Complication?" Theodore sighed, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke tuxedo. He refused to meet Amelia's eyes. "Amelia, I told you this wasn't an ordinary charity dinner. This is the Solstice Gala. The most powerful nocturnal families in the world are here tonight. The aesthetic, the expectation, it requires a certain refinement." "What are you saying, Theo?" Amelia's voice trembled, but she forced herself to stand tall, the crimson silk catching the light as she squared her shoulders. "He is saying, little girl, that you take up far too much space in a room meant for elegance." A cruel voice cut in. It belonged to Lord Nathaniel Croft, a vampire of considerable influence, his eyes glowing a faint, menacing amber. "Our kind prefers our vessels and companions to be delicate, fragile. You look as though you've never missed a decadent meal in your life. It is distasteful." A ripple of mocking laughter spread through the immediate circle, quickly infecting the nearby guests. The whispers began harsh and entirely intentional, meant for her to hear. "Look at how the silk strains at her hips." Theodore must have brought her as a joke. No immortal would ever look twice at a woman so heavy. Amelia's heart pounded violently against her ribs. She looked at Theodore, silently pleading with him to defend her, to say something, anything, to validate the 3 years they had spent together. Instead, Theodore looked at her with a mixture of pity and revulsion. "I'm sorry, Amelia," Theodore said coldly, slipping his hand down to rest on Genevieve's narrow waist. "But Lord Croft is right. An alliance between my family and the Duponts makes sense in this world. Geneviève fits the mold. You just don't. You should probably leave before you embarrass yourself any further." The words struck her like physical blows. The man who had whispered he loved her curves in the dark was now publicly discarding her to appease a room full of ancient snobs. The betrayal was absolute. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes, but a sudden fierce anger swallowed her sorrow. She would not cry in front of these monsters. "You're a coward, Theodore," Amelia said, her voice remarkably steady, carrying a quiet power that briefly silenced the laughing immortals nearby. "And you," she looked at Genevieve and Lord Croft, "are welcome to each other's empty, hollow lives." She turned on her heel, the heavy crimson train of her dress sweeping elegantly across the polished marble floor. She kept her chin high, focusing solely on the massive brass exit doors at the far end of the ballroom. The walk felt like miles. The whispering grew louder, a cruel symphony of mocking voices dissecting her every step, laughing at her lush, full body as she retreated. She just had to reach the doors. She just had to get out into the freezing New York air, away from the suffocating judgment. She reached out to grasp the heavy brass handle. Amelia's fingers were inches from the cool brass of the exit door when a deafening metallic clang echoed through the massive ballroom. The heavy oak and brass doors violently slammed shut on their own, the heavy deadbolts sliding into place with a sickeningly loud crack that vibrated through the floorboards. Amelia gasped, pulling her hand back just in time to avoid getting crushed. She grabbed the handle and pulled with all her might, but it was locked tight. Instantly, the ambient temperature in the grand room plummeted by 20 degrees. The breath of the human guests began to materialize in white, terrified puffs in the air. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing the cellist's bow, dropping to the floor in shock. The cruel whispers died instantly. The silence that fell over the Astor ballroom was absolute, heavy and suffocating with sudden dread. The shadows in the corners of the room began to stretch and writhe, creeping across the gold-leafed ceiling like living vines. "No," Lord Croft whispered from across the room, his previously arrogant voice now laced with raw, unadulterated terror. "It's not possible. He hasn't left the European sanctuary in a century." From the shadows near the grand staircase, a figure emerged. Cassius Vane, the vampire king. He was a terrifying vision of dark, lethal majesty. Standing well over 6 feet tall, Cassius possessed a rugged, devastatingly handsome face, carved from ancient, unforgiving stone. His hair was pitch black, falling carelessly over his forehead, and his eyes, a striking, luminous violet, burned with a quiet, ancient rage that commanded absolute submission. He wore no traditional tuxedo. Instead, he was clad in an impeccably tailored three-piece charcoal suit that barely contained the coiled, muscular power of his broad shoulders. Every vampire in the room, from the lowliest fledglings to ancient lords like Croft, immediately dropped to their knees, bowing their heads so low their noses nearly touched the marble. The wealthy humans, realizing the gravity of the moment and terrified by the sudden drop in temperature, quickly scrambled to do the same. Theodore Ashford hit the floor, dragging a trembling Genevieve down with him. Only one person remained standing: Amelia. She stood near the locked doors, her crimson dress a stark, bleeding contrast against the freezing, shadow-drenched room. She was too shocked, too frozen by the sheer magnetic gravity of the man walking down the stairs to move. Cassius did not look at the bowing crowd. He didn't acknowledge Lord Croft or the wealthy human elites who funded their secretive lives. His glowing violet eyes were locked entirely, unwaveringly on Amelia. He moved through the crowd with the fluid, silent grace of an apex predator. As he passed, the immortals shrank away, terrified of even brushing against his aura. Amelia's breath hitched as he stopped mere inches from her. Up close, he smelled of rain-soaked earth, cedarwood, and a dangerous electric ozone. He stared down at her, his eyes slowly mapping her face before dropping to trace the lush, curved lines of her body, encased in the red silk. There was no mockery in his gaze. There was no disdain. Instead, there was an intense, overwhelming reverence, mixed with a ravenous hunger that made Amelia's pulse hammer frantically in her throat. "Amelia!" Cassius spoke. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone that seemed to vibrate directly inside her chest. She blinked, her mind racing. How do you know my name?" "I have known your name since the day you were born," Cassius murmured, raising a large, cold hand. He gently traced the line of her jaw with his knuckles, his touch sending a jolt of electricity straight to her core. "I have waited centuries for my queen to reincarnate, and I arrived tonight to find these parasites driving you from my halls." The room collectively gasped, though no one dared lift their head. Cassius slowly turned his back to Amelia, his posture shifting from gentle protector to an ancient, wrathful god. He surveyed the kneeling crowd, his violet eyes burning brightly in the dimming light. "Stand, Theodore Ashford," Cassius commanded, his voice echoing off the gilded walls. Theodore scrambled to his feet, his knees visibly shaking, his face drained of all color. "My king," he stammered, bowing repeatedly. We did not expect you. We are honored." "Silence." Cassius didn't yell, but the sheer force of the word made Theodore snap his mouth shut, whimpering slightly. Cassius began to walk slowly toward the center of the room. "For decades, I have allowed you frail, vain creatures to dictate the aesthetic of our kind," he sneered, looking down at Genevieve, who was violently shivering on the floor. "You praise bone and starvation. You reject vitality, warmth, and life. You rejected her." He pointed a long finger back at Amelia. "You mocked the only true source of warmth this cold world has produced in 500 years. You called her unworthy because she possesses the very curves, the very softness, and life force that our ancestors worshipped in the old temples of Rome." Theodore swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit, but the doors remained sealed shut. "My king, I meant no disrespect. She is just a human, I thought." In a blur of motion so fast Amelia couldn't track it, Cassius was suddenly standing directly in front of Theodore. He grabbed the billionaire heir by the throat and lifted him effortlessly into the air. Theodore's legs kicked wildly, his hands clawing at Cassius's iron grip. "She is no mere human," Cassius snarled, his fangs briefly elongating, flashing brilliantly in the chandelier light. "She is my fated mate, the queen of the night, and you, a pathetic, arrogant child, dare to tell her she took up too much space." Cassius threw Theodore across the room. The young man crashed violently into the champagne fountain, sending thousands of crystal shards and expensive alcohol cascading across the floor. Genevieve let out a stifled, terrified shriek, covering her head. Cassius slowly turned back toward Amelia, extending his hand toward her. "No one leaves this room," the Vampire King announced, his eyes softening only as they met Amelia's, "until every single one of you begs for her forgiveness. And even then, only she will decide who walks out alive." The heavy silence in the Astor ballroom was broken only by the pathetic, ragged gasping of Theodore Ashford as he lay amidst the ruins of the crystal champagne fountain. Expensive vintage champagne mixed with the blood trickling from his forehead, staining his crisp white tuxedo shirt. Genevieve Dupont was huddled against the base of a marble pillar, her face buried in her hands, her delicate wayfish frame shaking violently as she sobbed in pure, unadulterated terror. Cassius Vane, the ancient sovereign of the nocturnal world, kept his large, impossibly cold hand extended toward Amelia. The violet fire in his eyes had softened into a deep, mesmerizing pool of absolute devotion. He did not rush her. He stood there, a towering monolith of dark power, offering her a choice that would permanently fracture the reality she had known just 10 minutes prior. Amelia looked from Cassius's outstretched hand to the bleeding form of the man who had just cruelly discarded her. Her mind spun wildly. A reincarnated queen, a fated mate. It sounded like the plot of one of the Gothic romance novels she secretly devoured in her apartment. Yet the supernatural chill in the room, the glowing eyes of the kneeling aristocrats, and the undeniable electric pull she felt toward Cassius were violently real. Even more grounding was the sudden, empowering realization of her own physical presence. Her bespoke crimson gown, heavily inspired by a classic Vera Wang design she had painstakingly modified to flatter her full hips and generous bust, felt less like a target for mockery and more like royal armor. With a deep, steadying breath, Amelia reached out and placed a hand in Cassius's. The moment their skin connected, a shockwave of raw, crackling energy rushed up Amelia's arm, sending a powerful jolt straight to her heart. The sensation was not painful. It was an awakening. A rush of fragmented images flooded her mind. Ancient Roman columns, bathed in moonlight, a heavy crown of black diamonds resting on her brow, and the same violet eyes looking down at her with centuries of enduring love. She gasped, her knees buckling slightly, but Cassius instantly stepped forward, wrapping a muscular arm around her waist and pulling her flush against his solid chest. He supported her completely, his hold fierce and possessive. "Breathe, my heart," Cassius murmured, his lips brushing the shell of her ear, sending shivers cascading down her spine. "The transition of memory is overwhelming, but you are safe. You have always been safe with me." Amelia blinked away, the dizzying visions, her gaze hardening as she looked out over the sea of kneeling elites. Among them, she recognized the faces of some of the most powerful, heavily guarded mortals in the world. There was Eleanor Rockefeller, gripping her pearl necklace in sheer panic, and tech billionaire Henry Carmichael, his face pressed against the cold floor. These were the untouchable titans of human society. The architects of global finance and fashion who dictated what was beautiful and what was worthy. Now they were cowering before her. "What happens now?" Amelia asked, her voice shockingly steady. She realized with a start that the fear that had plagued her all evening was entirely gone. Cassius turned her gently so they were facing the crowd together. "Now you rule," he said simply. "This society has grown arrogant. They have established a hierarchy based on superficial frailty, mocking the very essence of life and abundance that you represent. They have forgotten the old laws. You will remind them." He gestured toward the far end of the room, where Lord Nathaniel Croft was kneeling rigidly, his amber eyes cast downward. "Bring him," Cassius commanded softly, though the words carried to every corner of the vast room. Two massive, heavily scarred vampire guards, warriors who had been standing cloaked in the shadows the entire evening, instantly materialized beside Lord Croft. They hauled the ancient vampire to his feet and dragged him unceremoniously across the marble floor, throwing him down at Amelia's feet. "You had much to say about my queen's physical form, Nathaniel," Cassius said, his voice dangerously soft. "You dared to call her distasteful. Look at her now." Lord Croft slowly raised his head. The arrogance that had defined his features just moments ago was entirely erased, replaced by a desperate, groveling dread. "My king," Croft whispered, his voice trembling, "I was blind. I did not know the soul that resided within her. The modern era has corrupted our sensibilities. I beg for your mercy. I beg for her mercy." Amelia stared down at the creature who had spearheaded her humiliation. She remembered the sneer on his face, the way his cruel words had incited the laughter of the entire ballroom. She felt Cassius's hand subtly squeeze her waist, a silent reassurance that whatever she decided, he would enforce it with brutal finality. "You did not judge me because you didn't know who I was, Lord Croft," Amelia said, her voice ringing out clear and authoritative in the silent ballroom. "You judged me because you believed you possessed the power to make me feel small. You use your immortality and your wealth to enforce a standard that breaks women human and immortal alike, reducing them to starving, fragile ornaments." She took a deliberate step forward, the crimson silk of her gown sweeping over Lord Croft's outstretched hands. He flinched, pulling back as if she were made of fire. "I am not delicate," Amelia stated, her voice rising with newfound power. "I am full. I am vibrant. I carry the weight of life that you blood-starved parasites lack, and I will never apologize for taking up space in a room full of empty souls." Cassius let out a low, dark chuckle that vibrated with immense pride. "Beautifully spoken, my queen." He looked down at Croft. "For the crime of insulting the Queen of the Night, you are hereby stripped of your titles, your wealth, and your sanctuary in New York. You will live as a scavenger in the outer wastes. If I ever see your face in a civilized city again, I will personally pull your head from your shoulders." Croft let out a strangled cry of despair, but the two guards immediately hoisted him up and dragged him toward a side exit, his pleas echoing off the gilded ceiling before the heavy doors slammed shut behind him. Amelia watched him go, a profound sense of justice settling over her, but her eyes quickly shifted to the wreckage of the champagne fountain. Theodore was struggling to sit up, his face pale and slick with sweat and blood. Genevieve was crawling toward him, her sheer silver dress torn and ruined by the broken glass glass. It was time to deal with the man who had broken her heart. Amelia descended the 2 small marble steps that led from the main foyer down to the sunken dance floor, Cassius matching her pace exactly slightly behind her left shoulder, like an inescapable, lethal shadow. As she approached Theodore and Genevieve, the remaining guests scrambled backward on their knees, terrified of accidentally being in the king's path. Theodore looked up at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. The confident, arrogant heir to the Ashford banking fortune was gone. In his place was a broken, pathetic man bleeding onto the expensive floor he had thought he owned. "Amelia," Theodore rasped, coughing as a trickle of blood ran into his eye. "Amelia, please. We were together for 3 years. You know me. You know I didn't mean any of this. It was the pressure, the expectations of my family, of this society." Amelia looked down at him, her heart remarkably calm. She had expected to feel a surge of vindictive rage, or perhaps a lingering sting of the love she had once held for him. Instead, she felt nothing but cold, clinical pity. "You didn't mean it," Amelia echoed softly. "You bought this dress, Theodore. You brought me to this room knowing exactly what these monsters would say about my body. You wanted to humiliate me so you could justify replacing me with someone who fits your shallow, fragile aesthetic." She glanced at Genevieve, who whimpered and pressed her face against the floor, too terrified to even look at Cassius. "I was wrong," Theodore pleaded, reaching a trembling, blood-stained hand toward the hem of her crimson dress. Before his fingers could even brush the silk, Cassius's boot came down hard on Theodore's wrist. The sharp, sickening crack of breaking bone echoed loudly in the silent room. Theodore let out an agonizing, high-pitched scream, collapsing completely onto the glass-covered floor. "Do not dare to touch her!" Cassius snarled, his fangs fully descended, his eyes blazing with violet hellfire. "Your very breath is an insult to her presence." Amelia placed a gentle hand on Cassius's arm. The king instantly froze, the tension bleeding out of his broad shoulders at her touch. He looked at her, the feral anger in his eyes dialing back into protective devotion. "He isn't worth your anger, Cassius," Amelia said softly, testing the name on her tongue. It felt ancient, heavy, and perfectly right. She turned her attention back to Theodore, who was cradling his shattered wrist, sobbing openly. "I could ask the king to kill you, Theodore," Amelia stated, her tone conversational, which only made the threat more terrifying. "I could ask him to tear you and Genevieve apart in front of your wealthy, untouchable friends, and he would do it without a second thought." "Please," Genevieve sobbed from the floor, her French accent entirely stripped of its previous condescension. "Please, mademoiselle, I am nothing. We are nothing. Spare us." Amelia looked at the French heiress, noting how small and pathetic she looked in her ruined silver slip, the societal ideal of beauty groveling at the feet of the woman they had deemed unworthy. "I won't kill you," Amelia declared. A collective, quiet sigh of relief seemed to ripple through the human contingent of the room. "Death is too easy. It is too quick a punishment for the cruelty you both harbor." She looked up, scanning the faces of the kneeling billionaires and ancient vampires. "Theodore Ashford and Genevieve Dupont are hereby banished from this society. Any human family that does business with the Ashfords or the Duponts, any immortal who offers them patronage or protection, will answer directly to the king. You will lose your wealth, Theodore. You will lose your status, Genevieve. You will live the rest of your mortal lives as outcasts, entirely forgotten by the world you worshipped." Theodore's eyes widened in sheer horror. For a man who had built his entire identity on wealth and elitism, this was a fate far worse than death. "Amelia, no, you can't do this. My family's legacy. Your legacy ended the moment you let these doors lock behind me," Amelia interrupted, her voice hard and uncompromising. She turned away from them, effectively erasing their existence from her reality. She looked up at Cassius, who was watching her with an expression of such intense, overwhelming adoration that it made her breath hitch. "Is the judgment to your satisfaction, my king?" she asked, a small, genuine smile finally breaking across her face. Cassius reached out, gently cupping her cheek, his thumb tracing the soft, full curve of her jaw. "You are magnificent," he whispered, his voice thick with centuries of longing. "Merciful, yet ruthlessly just. You are exactly as I remembered you, my beautiful queen. He turned his gaze to the massive, heavy brass doors at the far end of the ballroom. With a mere flick of his wrist, the heavy deadbolts violently snapped backward. The doors blew wide open, letting in a rush of crisp, freezing New York winter air that whipped through the room, fluttering the crimson silk of Amelia's gown. "We are leaving," Cassius announced to the room at large, wrapping his heavy charcoal suit jacket around Amelia's bare shoulders to shield her from the cold. The jacket smelled of rich cedar and that intoxicating, dangerous ozone. "This city belongs to the Queen now. When we return, the rules of your pathetic society will be rewritten. Anyone who defies the new order will meet the sun." With a final terrifying glare at the kneeling masses, Cassius placed a firm, protective hand on the small of Amelia's back and guided her toward the exit. As they walked out of the Astor ballroom, leaving the ruined, sobbing Theodore and the terrified elite behind them, Amelia stepped into the freezing Manhattan night. She looked up at the towering, dark skyline, realizing that her life as a normal, insecure human was over. She was no longer the girl who took up too much space. She was the queen of the night, and beside the most powerful, dangerous creature in the world, she was finally exactly where she belonged. What an absolutely epic finale. Amelia reclaimed her power, shattered the toxic beauty standards of the elite, and handed Theodore the ultimate punishment, a life of absolute ruin. And Cassius, he proved that true royalty recognizes true beauty, curves and all. If you loved watching Amelia take her rightful throne and want more thrilling, satisfying vampire romance stories where the underdogs win, make sure to smash that like button, share this video with someone who loves a dramatic twist, and subscribe to our channel for more intense romantic storytelling.